as we work our way through this final part of the book of James. Now, this last little appendix or this last little section of James is describing the way things work. And I've broken the content down into 3 headings. The way things should be, the way things often are, and the way things will be. So James is talking, and it's appropriate in a book about wisdom because you're thinking, because it's about making choice, it's about action or thinking about previous action or fitting that action into a context. You want to know how things work. And so James appropriately is going to be talking about the way things should be, the way things often are, and the way things will be. Now, to help us understand and apply that, I'm kind of using the theme of holidays. And you might have seen that, a classic Australian film, The Castle, filmed in 1997, year after I graduated high school. And this classic Australian film, and it's really worth looking up and watching, Australian comedy. And one of the features of this film was that the family, this working class family, went on holidays to Bonnie Doon. And I was looking it up in preparation for the sermon, and I didn't realise until just recently that it was an actual Victorian town, an actual location. And until now, I kind of thought it was this sort of fictional place, because in the movie, it's not a very glamorous place to have a holiday. It's got it's a lake, yes, and there's little houses, little shacks. However, there's big sort of electrical pylons in the background, and there's no real beach, and it's sort of in the middle of nowhere, and it doesn't seem like a very glamorous place to take a holiday. And holidays are kind of significant, aren't they? Because you work and then you rest, and sometimes you'll save up a lot of money, and you'll save up annual leave, and you'll put aside the time, and you'll prepare yourself, and you'll look forward to holidays, and you'll think, this is what I'm going to do on the holiday, and you plan, and you perhaps you're a bit of a researcher, and you think, oh, is this place, what's it going to be like? And you plan ahead, and you prepare, and you think, this holiday I'm really looking forward to this particular holiday. But this is where we need to hear the wisdom of the book of James. Because James needs to tell us about the way things work. And firstly, the way things should be. You see, James is laying out in verses 13 to 16 the ideal behaviour of a wise guy or a wise woman, a wise man or a wise woman. Ideally, how should you be behaving? What does ideal action look like in the world? Given all that James has talked about, and given how it fits into the wisdom genre, and given how it fits into God's big story, what does ideal wisdom look like? Now, let's just quickly survey these verses to see what James says. James says, well, starting in verse 13, if you're in trouble, pray. If you've got something to give thanks about, then sing a chorus or a hymn, sing to the Lord, pray to the Lord. If you're sick, then, and God willing, you're a servant of Jesus and you're part of a congregation of other servants of Jesus, then ask the leaders to pray for you and anoint you. And James says, sickness will be healed and sins forgiven. And so he finishes by saying, well, confess your sins, be healed and be forgiven. James is describing here the way things should be. And I think verse 15 particularly sums it up, doesn't it? And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise him or her up. If he has sinned, they will be forgiven. Now, the first thing to note about these verses is that the direction of these verses is true. They're heading in they're describing a true direction. In the long run, there is forgiveness and healing. And the other thing to also note about these verses is that God is all-powerful. God is both good and all-powerful, all good and all-powerful. So he always hears our prayers. It's not just because he's always able to hear our prayers, he's all powerful, but he's also good. He wants to hear our prayers. So we know that to be true, and we also know that if we're servants of Jesus and we're therefore part of God's big story, then we're going to be resurrected. And not only that, is we live this side of the cross. The cross is behind us. And on the cross, Jesus paid for our sins. That's not held against us anymore. And then the sins we commit, sadly, because we're hypocrites, we're recovering hypocrites, between the cross and the future, between D-Day and V-Day, the sins we commit in that territory, and as sort of doubly sad as that is, they're also paid for. Paid for back on the cross, and then we'll see that vindication once we get to the end, which kind of brings us back full circle to the beginning of James chapter 1. If we keep plodding towards Jesus, plodding towards our final, complete forgiveness, when our slate is completely wiped clear because of what Jesus did in the past, historically, back during the times of the Roman Empire. And so it's true when you look at the direction that things are going. When you look at the big picture, what James is describing here is true. And it's also true on another level. It's true in the sense it's morally true. It's spiritually true. This is how you should behave. If you are in trouble, you should talk to the Lord. If things are going well, then you should be singing. You should be singing and thanksgiving to God. This is how things should be. And this is what wisdom is, isn't it? Wisdom is thinking about how things should be. That's part of the fitting the choices you make, that it's fitting those choices into the pattern of how things should be. And that's one of the wonderful blessings, isn't it? And James doesn't say it, but I think it's worth noting that one of the wonderful blessings of being a servant of Jesus is we don't have wisdom in a vacuum. That's a good thing, isn't it? I think a good illustration of thinking about holidays and the way things should be is this ad for tourism in Tasmania. The restrictions are lifting, and so you can imagine the Tasmanian government will be releasing more ads like this. And one of the interesting things about advertisements, and particularly tourism, ads for tourism, because they're trying to create a particular feeling and sensation and idea about a particular place. They're trying to make you think a holiday in this particular place would be wonderful. And if you've already been there, it'll kind of trigger those feelings again. And if you haven't been there, you'll be thinking, that's what it should be. That's what a good holiday ad will make you feel, this is the way things should be. But you've probably been thinking, as I've been saying all this, sometimes this feels inconsistent with my ordinary lived experience. You've talked about it being directionally true, like true in the long term, true in the past. And you've talked about it sort of being morally and spiritually true. Yes, if I am in trouble, I should be praying. And I should be singing songs of thanksgiving. But that's not how often my life ends up turning out. It feels, for a book about consistency, it feels a bit inconsistent, doesn't it? I mean, that's potentially what you might be thinking as you read through verses 13 to 16, and as you think the prayer offered in faith will make a sick person well. You might be thinking, well, I felt like I have prayed in faith to the living God with all the things you've said, with the resurrection in mind and the cross in mind. But the person that I've prayed for hasn't been raised up. And this is why James is laying things out, because he first wants you to see, he wants to exhort you. He wants you to see, as you do wisdom, as you think about wisdom, as you, it's kind of hard to describe, you be wise, I guess. As you're seeking to be wise, James wants you to keep these things in mind. If you are sick, to seek prayer. If you are in trouble, to pray. If you if things are good, then to sing in thanksgiving, to join with other people and sing together or sing by yourself. That's how James says that's the wise way to respond. But you know what's also going on here as we think about perhaps the mismatch between what James is talking about and our ordinary experience, is James is highlighting that. He's not unaware of that. Because remember, the theme so far has been a bit of tough medicine as he's talked about hypocrisy. And in the same way, even when he talks about practical or more positive things, James is still provocative. He's like his older brother Jesus, provoking us. And he wants us to see the mismatch, to see that inconsistency, to see that sometimes right here and now things don't exactly work out the way you expect. Sometimes the answer that you receive is no, and sometimes it's hard to see how that answer fits in. And this is why it's important to read the book of James alongside other wisdom literature, so like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and to see and to think about wisdom across the whole genre. Remember what I said at the very beginning about fitting wisdom in to the larger pattern. So James wants us to see that inconsistency, feel that inconsistency. Things are not the way they should be. And he also wants us to realize that the opposite direction, so where he's saying this is the way things should be. You should be heading to Tasmania for your holiday, or whatever holiday destination you'd like to go to. That should be the ideal. But he also, by leaving the inconsistency unspoken, sitting there next to the text, he also wants us to realize that there is an inconsistency because of the curse that we're living under. We're cursed by the decay that comes from Adam. We're living out Adam's choice, whether we want to or not. Our bodies are decaying, and if we continue to be hypocrites and we give in to being a hypocrite and we stop plodding and we just slide back the other direction, then we'll need more and more healing to the point where we'll be completely given over to decay. This is why the direction is important. It might feel as though sometimes it's disconnected from your ordinary lived experience. But if you don't see the direction, you won't see where you're going. You won't see the path that where you will be ultimately raised up in the resurrection. You will be completely healed. So you need to see that direction. Which brings us now to the way things often are, verses 17 to 18. So here James gives the example of Elijah. Elijah prayed it wouldn't rain and it didn't. And then Elijah prayed it would rain and it did. What's James doing with this little Old Testament illustration about prayer? Well, he's continuing on the thinking about prayer and the way that prayer plays an important part in wisdom. He wants us to see that. But what's he doing with this illustration? Well, he wants us to see that the way things often are not like that. He kind of uses this provocative example from the Old Testament. And if you read the story of Elijah, the events surrounding those few years in Elijah's ministry and Israel's history are really intense and significant. And it kind of does Elijah's head in. He's not able to cope after this kind of exceptional moment and the other events around that moment in Elijah's ministry. And James is giving this notable exception because he wants us to realize that things, the way things often are. He wants us to be realistic. And in a way, this is an indirect, subtle nod to the cynicism of Ecclesiastes. That's not the cynicism of Ecclesiastes is not James's main message, though, but it's a nod in that direction and another reminder to read these books alongside each other. And I mean, I probably shouldn't, hopefully no one watching this is near Bonnie Doon or it really enjoys holidays in Bonnie Doon, now that I know it's a real place. But that holiday from Bonnie Doon kind of reminds me that sometimes holidays, you might think, oh, this is the way it should be, this is the way my holiday should be. And then sometimes you have those holidays where it doesn't work out. I've relatives who like to bushwalk and camp and things like that. And you often hear stories from these relatives. In fact, some of them are part of the congregation now, where you hear stories of fantastic trips where the way things should be is the way things are. But then you hear about trips where the reality is completely different. And it turns out to be a holiday in Bonnie Doon, although I think the characters of the film kind of have really low expectations, so a holiday in Bonnie Doon doesn't matter. But for most of us, a holiday in Bonnie Doon, and we think, what? You don't want a holiday that turns out like that. But that's what James wants us to see, that it's not always like the Elijah moment. That's a notable exception for us to see the power and potency of prayer. He wants us to see that, but he also wants us to see that he's provoking us. That where we are right now, as you make your choices, as you seek to be wise, you need to be honest and clear about the way things often are, and also about the way things should be. Because James doesn't want you to take these verses or take this particular verse and kind of put it in like a line of computer code. You know, like a line of computer code, if there's one character or one thing wrong, either in the syntax or the layout of that piece of computer code, then you'll get an error and it won't work. It's not like that, where you must sort of do this line of code exactly and then you'll get X or Y result. No. He's provoking us with an example. He wants you to take your lived experience of being wise or seeking to be wise and to fit it into the larger pattern. He wants you to think about, where are you in history? Where are you in God's big story? Where are you in the times of your life? And also, not just time-wise, where are you? And that was a big theme from last week, wasn't it? But if you're part of God's big story, what sort of plot point are you at? And this takes a lot of prayer and thanksgiving, and it takes other brothers and sisters, and it takes reading the Bible and thinking about the Bible and applying it, and question time and small group and C.S. Lewis book club. It takes all of these things to make that calculation. But that's what James wants you to do. He's provoking you to make that calculation, to think, where does this choice fit? Which brings us to the last couple of verses of the book of James, and the last couple of verses for today, verses 19 to 20, the way things will be. Because in these verses, James wants you to see that the way things will be is that the ordinary and the spiritual will converge. In fact, the historical and the ordinary and the spiritual will all converge together. And that's the way things will be. You see, he wants you to realize that, well, he wants you both positively, the way things will be, is that if you're a servant of Jesus, then your destination, the plot line you're on leads to your resurrection. You will be raised up. You will be made clean. You will be made complete. That's the destination. That's where you're heading. That's the way things will be. So it's this beautiful moment where in verses 19 to 20, James talks about bringing sinners back, rescuing sinners, where to do that for each other. And then he says, remember this, whoever turns a sinner from the error of his way will save him from death and cover over a multitude of sins. You see, the way things will be a convergence of the spiritual and the ordinary and the historical and the spiritual. Because what will happen is, just as you're kind of sadly, frustratingly, kind of living out Adam's curse and your body is decaying. At the same time, if you're a servant of Jesus, then your body is also on another trajectory. You're casting off that old body and you're heading towards a new body. And you're heading towards complete forgiveness and healing. And then the sad, frightening corollary of that is you're also heading, if you're not a servant of Jesus, towards the complete finality of decay and becoming the sins that you've been rescued from. And so there's these kind of two paths there. James is focusing on the positive one, but it's worth just noting, because we've been kind of looking at both sides of this passage. It's worth noting the danger there. But going back to that positive, if you're a servant of Jesus, then it's not just that this spiritual advice that James is giving kind of stays spiritual, but you become more spiritual. You become someone who is forgiven. You know, I've talked about that example from C.S. Lewis about the man that becomes the grumble because he keeps grumbling, and so God gives him over to the thing he keeps doing and ultimately chooses. And the opposite is true, that as you keep choosing Jesus and as you keep choosing forgiveness and praise and thanksgiving, you become a thanksgiving. That's the way things will be. And this is an extraordinary hope. It's not just that we have a pattern of the way things should be to help us be wise, and people look at us and think, wow, you know, that person's so consistent, that Christian's so consistent, and they really know the way things should be. It's not just that. But but this is why the historical and the spiritual come together, the historical and your ordinary life come together. Because we know that this is the way things will be. There's another great movie that you should watch, completely different to The Castle. It's called Collateral, and filmed in 2004. And it's about how people react to nihilism. And it's about a taxi driver and a nihilistic assassin. And the taxi driver in his taxi has, and it's a bit of a theme in the story, has a postcard sort of on the visor, tucked into the visor above, at the top of his car there. And he pulls down the visor and he looks at the little postcard, and it's a picture of sort of this island in the Caribbean that he'd love to go to, an island that he'd love to have a holiday at. You know, and because the film's about an exploration of how people react to nihilism, it's a hollow hope. It's a sad hope. It's not a genuine, deep hope. It's not the way things will be for him, for within the framework of that film. And this is the hope we have. It's not just that spiritually things will work out, but ordinarily things will work out for you. That this is where you're going. This is the way things will be. Because the theme of James has been hypocrisy, wisdom for hypocrites. And we've seen so many times how potent hypocrisy is. But I think what James is showing us here, in verse 20, whoever turns a sinner away from the error of his way will save him from death and cover over a multitude of sins. Hypocrisy is potent, but rescue from hypocrisy is equally potent. It's a little bit out of place, but because C.S. Lewis is saying something else, but our book club has been looking at the Weight of Glory collection of essays, and from the Weight of Glory essay itself, because it's about holidays, and it connects somewhat. I just want to finish with this quote from the Weight of Glory essay by C.S. Lewis. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by an offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the book of James. Thank you that you give us wisdom. Thank you that you show us the way things should be. And even though we might not want to, you show us the way things often are as well. But thank you so much that you also show us the way things will be. Thank you that the rescue from hypocrisy is as potent as hypocrisy itself. Thank you so much for James's older brother. We trust him in his name.